Number 10. The Underwater Aquarium at Silver Key. There is a creepy, abandoned aquarium on Silver Key in the city of Nassau in the Bahamas. It's called the Coral Island Marine Park, and once upon a time, it was a bustling tourist destination. The aquarium originally opened in 1987 and was one of the biggest parks of its kind at the time. It was a museum as well as an underwater observatory. Tourists could check out sharks, turtles, stingrays, and there were snorkeling trails where they could see wildlife in its natural habitat. It was honestly one of the greatest underwater marine viewing parks ever built. Alas, the fun didn't last forever though. When Hurricane Floyd showed up and hit the Bahamas in 1999, it caused significant damage. The marine park was partly destroyed, which caused it to be temporarily shut down, but unfortunately, it never reopened. The park has been abandoned ever since and basically completely forgotten. Tour guides don't even know what the structure used to be. They just tell tourists that it's an abandoned lighthouse. But the truth is that this was once a place where you could literally walk underwater and interact with some of the most fascinating marine creatures in the world. Now it just looks creepy, like an underwater space needle. Number 9. Burwash Correctional Center. Deep in the frozen landscape of the Canadian province Ontario, there is a bizarre and rather ominous abandoned structure called the Burwash Correctional Center. It originally opened over 100 years ago in 1914 and quickly became such a popular prison that an entire community grew up around it. The community was even built by the inmates themselves, designed to house somewhere around 1,000 residents to work at the prison and at the local farm. But in 1975, the prison was deemed too costly for the government, and so it was shut down. But they never demolished the entire thing, leaving its ugly red brick building to slowly erode by the brutal elements. Today, the correctional center is still there, but it's located in the absolute middle of nowhere. There's actually no road that leads to the prison. You have to hike over 2 miles after parking your car on the side of the road just to get there. And what makes this such a great place to explore is that the community is also abandoned. When the government shut down the facility, they also shut down the community and pushed everyone who didn't want to leave out. The federal government purchased the property for nearly $2 million in an attempt to turn the area into a goat farm, but it proved to be a huge waste of money, and sadly, nobody farmed any goats here. Number 8. Wisconsin's Cold War Missile Site. There is a strange abandoned missile silo from the Cold War in Wisconsin. In fact, there are actually 8 different government defense sites scattered around Milwaukee, and this is only one of them. It's located in Waukesha, the Nike control site M74. It had actual launching pads, ground radar equipment, and everything else the government thought was necessary to protect the Midwest in the event of a full-scale Russian bombing. It was functional from between the 1950s until 1972, when it was finally decommissioned. After that, the land was handed over to the city and then cleaned up. But it wasn't completely cleaned. Much of the equipment is still there, abandoned, and nobody quite knows what to do with it. The missiles here were designed to destroy anything coming at the area, blowing up Russian missiles before they could ever touch ground. There's an abandoned bunker here, pieces of equipment looking like forgotten jungle gym pieces, and what little is left of the radar tower itself. Number 7. Linwood Hall. Linwood Hall is an abandoned estate considered to be one of the greatest mansions in America from the Gilded Age that is still standing today. At one point, it was one of the most luxurious pieces of real estate in Pennsylvania. It kind of looks like the White House, especially with its huge white pillars supporting the extravagant portico in the front. But sadly, Linwood Hall has been abandoned for years. It's in an absolute state of disrepair, and nobody seems interested in doing anything with the property. It was built between 1897 and 1900 for a US tycoon and one of the investors of the Titanic. His name was Peter Errol Brown Widener. He was one of the richest Americans to ever live in the country. The garden of this huge estate was landscaped by the famous French architect Jacques Clébe. The whole palace, because really, this was a palace, was draped in silk and filled with collectible treasures from all around the world. But after Peter died, then his son died, nobody wanted to take care of the estate. The family abandoned it. A property developer purchased it in 1948 for only $130,000. It was sold again in 1952, and even 70 years later, pretty much nothing has changed. The treasure has been cleaned out, and it's been stripped of its previous splendor, but it's still standing the same as it was in 1900, only ugly and forgotten. If you could buy this abandoned mansion for just $5, would you uproot your life and move in tomorrow? Let us know your thoughts on this amazing piece of abandoned property in the comments below, and if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. Number 6. Haunted School. There's an abandoned school in Kent, England that is said to be haunted. It's called the Lilsden School for Girls, and it's so creepy that it was featured as a filming location in the zombie movie 28 Days Later. The school was built out of what was once an estate mansion, originally constructed in 1855. It was requisitioned in World War I and used as a hospital for soldiers. After World War I is when it turned into a school for girls, but by 1975, this kind of segregation was over, and it became just a general school for boys and girls. It closed in 1999 because of falling attendance. For whatever reason, parents just didn't want to send their kids to school there. After the school shut down, it was abandoned. People now say there's a young boy's ghost haunting the halls of the neglected structure. The young boy supposedly died at the school and can be seen in some of the broken mirrors and fractured glass windows. But of course, this is just a rumor. Number 5. An entire Spanish village. A Spanish village that was abandoned 30 years ago recently reappeared after spending the last 3 decades underwater. It's called Aceredo, and the structures here are sad and honestly a little depressing. The village was home to about a dozen families until they were kicked out so that the government could make a new water reservoir. Everyone abandoned their homes. A Portuguese hydroelectric plant closed its floodgates, and the entire village ended up under the water. But recently, the water level in the reservoir became so low that the entire village reappeared from its watery void. And amazingly, there were a handful of homes still standing. There are cars in the village, people's personal possessions lying on lawns, and even bottles still standing upright on shelves. In fact, there was even water still gushing out of the village fountain. The place is wholly destroyed, looking like it got wiped out by a nuclear bomb. Number 4. The Lenox Castle. The Lenox Castle Hospital can be found in Glasgow, Scotland. It's a curious structure with a long and complicated history. The castle itself was constructed in the 1830s as a private piece of real estate. It was in the early part of the 20th century that the castle was converted into what became a psychiatric hospital. But by 2002, the institution was shut down and abandoned, and for the past almost 20 years, it's been slowly crumbling to dust. The plan to turn it into a mental hospital came in 1925. By 1936, the castle became what was known back then as a mental deficiency institution. It was way ahead of its time in terms of treatment for the patients. There was room for over 1,200 people with separate dormitories for males and females. There was access to communal dining halls, there were cinema shows and recreational facilities. But after its great start, the hospital began to deteriorate. It became extremely overcrowded, the government stopped funding it, and many patients were left to fend for themselves. It became a free-for-all, with people who had mental disabilities struggling to find food for themselves inside the halls of this spooky castle. Dr. Alistair Sim, the medical director for the hospital in the 1980s, called it wretched and dehumanizing. He said he never worked in a worse pit and was sick to his stomach by what he saw inside the walls of his own hospital. So, all things considered, maybe it's a good thing the structure is now abandoned. Number 3. Satsep Nuclear Power Plant. The Satsep Nuclear Power Plant in Elma, Washington was one of the most ambitious projects in the US back in the 1970s. But like every other nuclear project in America, this one had heaps of problems. The Washington Public Power Supply System allegedly defaulted on over $2 billion in bonds. The project was plagued by overcosts, and construction finally stopped in 1982. This left the power plant just a little over half complete. Giant cooling towers and the half-finished domes of reactor containment structures were left abandoned. And yes, they are still abandoned today, but this is one of those rare cases where an abandoned power plant has gotten a makeover. In 2013, there was an initiative to turn the ugly abandoned power plant into an industrial center. While the structures of the plant are still abandoned and just as grim as they were in the 1980s, there is now a technology campus on site. There's an acoustical lab for film shoots at a tunnel training site used by the Seattle Fire Department. Number 2. The Waukesha Light. The Waukesha Light is a ruined lighthouse at the northern end of Lake Michigan. It was originally used to protect boats from Chicago from crashing into the narrow tip at this part of the lake. Plus, the area around the tip, called Waukesha's Point, is shallow, easy for boats to wreck themselves. The lighthouse was established in 1851 and then deactivated in 1912. In 1871, the lighthouse keepers rang bells for days on end to protect vessels during the Great Chicago Fire from crashing into the rocks. Because of the thick smoke, the lighthouse light was invisible to those out on the water. But ever since 1912, the building has been abandoned. Nobody has done any maintenance to it, and it's steadily eroded and deteriorated. Experts believe it's only a matter of time before the whole structure crumbles into the lake and is lost forever. Number 1. Hotel of Doom. The Ryugyong Hotel, also known as North Korea's Hotel of Doom, is by far one of the strangest abandoned structures anywhere in the world. This place is a massive super skyscraper over 1,000 feet in height and supposedly filled with over 3,000 rooms. It was designed to have 5 revolving restaurants with incredible panoramic views of the area. But guess what? This luxury super hotel never actually opened. It never even got the chance to live up to all of its potential. Ground was broken in 1987, it reached its maximum height in 1992, and then the construction just stopped. They didn't even put any windows on the superstructure for 16 years. It was just a big concrete monster towering over the city. But since then, there has been some work done. Metal and glass have been installed, lights were put in so that the hotel could be lit up at night. However, it has still never been opened to guests. The tallest building in Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, has been abandoned ever since construction started and shows no signs of being occupied anytime soon. But this shouldn't really come as a surprise. North Korea isn't exactly a destination people choose for a vacation.
Number 10. The H.L. Hunley. The H.L. Hunley was a submarine built in 1863 by a company in Alabama. It was a submersible vessel, the first of its kind to ever sink an enemy ship during a war. The Confederates were the ones who came up with the idea. But after the submarine made its first kill, both the vessel and its crew were lost to the sea. The one thing the H.L. Hunley proved in February of 1864 when she sank the USS Housatonic was that submarines would become the future of naval warfare. And that they did. The Hunley rammed into the Housatonic without the ship ever really knowing what happened. It detonated a torpedo on board, ripping the Union vessel apart and sending it to the bottom of the Charleston harbor along with itself. The blast was so big that it blew up the target ship and the submarine, killing everyone involved. The haunting wreckage of the Union submarine was discovered 131 years later by the author Clive Cussler and his team with the National Underwater and Marine Agency. They'd been searching for the sub for 14 years and were excited to finally discover it off the coast of South Carolina. They then recovered the historic vessel and took it to the Clemson University Restoration Institute to be preserved for generations to come. Number 9. Old Ironside. The USS Constitution, known by many as Old Ironsides, is a heavy frigate that belongs to the United States Navy. She's one of the oldest ships still afloat to this day. The vessel was originally launched in 1797. She was one of 6 frigates authorized for construction by none other than George Washington himself. The ship didn't see any action in World War I or World War II, but did battle it out in the War of 1812 against the United Kingdom. It's amazing to think about just how quickly things change. The USS Constitution fought against the British, capturing merchant ships and even destroying 5 fully fledged British warships. The public adoration of this boat is what saved it from being scrapped repeatedly. It's now become something of an American icon, even though it was retired way back in 1881. It was designated a museum in 1907, but in 1997, on her 200th birthday, was still sailing. And as of right now, this is a commissioned Navy ship with a crew of 60 officers. But of course, being such an old ship, she does have her ghosts. Over 260 officers and crew have died on board while serving their country, and some say their spirits still haunt the ship to this day. Number 8. The Nazi Spy Hunter. The wreckage of the U.S. revenue cutter Bear has been located after decades lost at sea. The ship gained great infamy in World War II as a Nazi hunter. It began working as a commercial vessel in 1874, was purchased by the government in the 1880s to be used for work in the Arctic. It played a role as a relief ship during the Spanish pandemic between 1918 and 1919. It's even been used in modern times as a set for Hollywood movies. But its real fame was in 1941 when it was patrolling the Arctic waters for the Navy. It helped capture a Norwegian trawler that had been used by the German military intelligence forces to report on weather conditions. The ship was ultimately decommissioned near the end of the war in 1944 and left at a wharf in Halifax, Nova Scotia. But it sank in 1963 during a storm. It was being towed back to Philadelphia, but it would never make it. It was just off the coast of Nova Scotia when the waves swallowed it whole. The wreckage was lost at the bottom of the ocean until scientists finally located it just recently in 2021. Number 7. The Mary Rose. If you've ever wondered which warship was King Henry VIII's favorite, and honestly, who hasn't stayed up at night wondering this very thing, you're in for a real treat. Archaeologists in the UK say that his favorite warship was the Mary Rose. It was one of the largest Navy ships in England and served for over 3 decades. It fought wars against France, against Brittany, and even against Scotland. Sadly, she laid on the seabed for over 400 years, slowly decaying until she was raised in 1982. To date, there's no historical warship more haunting and more imposing than the Mary Rose. It's just an absolute beast of a vessel, and its story is terrifying. The Mary Rose, after being victorious in so many wars, was completely destroyed, and 500 men on board died in 1545. The ship was leading the assault against the French invasion fleet, but went down during the fighting. Why the ship went down has been a mystery for centuries. Some say it's because she fired all the guns on one side while turning, and while there was a very strong gust of wind. This may have caused the ship to tilt, take on water, and smash itself apart before sinking. If the Mary Rose was King Henry VIII's favorite warship, what's yours? Let us know if you have one in the comments below, and if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. Number 6. HMAS Sydney. DNA evidence has just revealed the identity of Australia's most famous unknown soldier. His name was Thomas Welsby Clark, just 20 years old when he joined the HMAS Sydney and went out to war. But as the ship sailed through the Indian Ocean in 1941, it was ambushed by a German raider, and all 645 men on board died. It was one of the worst maritime disasters in Australian history. 3 months after the boat sank, a mysterious body washed to the shores of Christmas Island. The individual was dressed in Navy overalls, but this was before DNA, so nobody had any way to identify him. He was buried on the island and forgotten about for decades, until the government finally dug him up and buried him on the mainland with proper military honors. The wreckage of the HMS Sydney was discovered in 2008, though no other bodies were ever found. They weren't found inside the wreckage because it had been too long, and their bones had already been picked clean by the fish. And now, after years of DNA testing, Australia has finally revealed Thomas Clark's identity by matching the genetic material from his teeth with DNA from his surviving descendants. Number 5. Japanese ghost ships. A whole host of Japanese ghost ships have risen from their murky graves like giant metal zombies. It's all thanks to seismic activity from an underwater volcano about 700 miles south of Tokyo. About 24 ships that had been buried since World War II were literally hefted out of the ocean and back to the surface by the sudden shifting of the tectonic plates. In total, 24 dead vessels were pushed onto the shore on the western part of Iwo Jima. All these boats were sunk by U.S. forces during the Battle of Iwo Jima in 1945. It was one of the bloodiest battles during the war. 36 days of brutal fighting against 70,000 Marines and 20,000 Japanese soldiers. The soldiers were hiding in bunkers on the island, so it was a nightmare for the Marines to get at them. In the end, about 20,000 Marines were wounded, 7,000 were killed. The 20,000 Japanese soldiers were all killed in action, except for 216 that were captured alive. Number 4. The R-8 submarine. The creepy wreckage of a lost American submarine that fought during World War I has been found by a New Jersey salvage team. The discovery was made off the coast of the Delmarva Peninsula by using sonar data. The team identified a huge chunk of something artificial sitting beneath the water, and it turned out to be the wreckage of the R-8 submarine. one of 27 commissioned by the U.S. Navy during the First World War. Gary Kozak, the guy who was brought in to analyze the sonar data, says there's no doubt that they've found the wreckage. The size, the location, the shape, it all points to the lost R8. The only issue is that divers haven't actually been able to go down there to get a good look at the haunting piece of oversized scrap metal. This submarine never served much of a purpose throughout any of the wars. By the time it was finally built in 1918, World War I was already over. It was deployed as part of the Pacific Fleet during the 1920s, but it came back to the East Coast in 1930. It was then used for bombing target practice until it sank. Number 3. The Invincible Armada. If you're into haunting shipwrecks, the coast of Mayo in Spain needs to be on your bucket list. The coastline here is dotted with shipwrecks that date to the Spanish Armada of 1588. The group of ships was nicknamed La Armada Invencible, or the Invincible Armada. It was commissioned by King Philip II to be capable of invading the Kingdom of England from the sea. The Armada was the result of decades of rivalries between England and Spain over everything from religious squabbles to trade problems. The Armada was to escort the Spanish army all the way across the English Channel to where they could invade England. Sadly for Spain, that's not what happened. 27 ships and 9,000 Spanish soldiers were blown north to the Irish coast, where they were brutally murdered. Irish chieftains and English troops slaughtered the soldiers that washed ashore, while the rest died as their ships sank off the coast. The point is that the invasion failed. A lot of the vessels ended up back in Spain, where for one reason or another they sank and wound up along the Mayo coast. And so did plenty of ships during World War I and World War II. The entire Mayo coast is littered with haunting ancient warships, broken pirate ships, and military vessels blown apart by torpedoes in the 1940s. Number 2. The USS Lexington. The wreckage of the USS Lexington was found on the bottom of the Coral Sea after 76 years at rest. That's about 500 miles from the eastern coast of Australia. It was found by an expedition crew 2 miles beneath the surface, making it one of the deepest shipwrecks ever discovered. According to Robert Kraft, who had been involved with the discovery, the Lexington was one of the capital ships that was lost during the fighting of World War II. It was also one of the first aircraft carriers ever built by the U.S., named Lady Lex. When it was blown apart, it had 35 aircrafts on board. But the Lexington didn't die for nothing. It was part of a very important battle, the Battle of the Coral Sea. She went up against 3 fully stocked Japanese carriers, making it the first carrier versus carrier battle in naval history. It was also the first time during the war that Japanese forces suffered a serious defeat and were halted in their advance on New Guinea and Australia. The USS Lexington was destroyed and 216 crew members were killed in a haunting battle, but it may have prevented Japan from reaching the shores of Australia and doing unthinkable damage. Number 1. Bermuda Shipwreck. The Bermuda Shipwreck, not to be confused with the Bermuda Triangle, was a wooden schooner that sank in Murray Bay years ago in October of 1870. Murray Bay is located on Grand Island, Michigan. The ship itself is 130 feet long and it's still intact for the most part, despite it being over a century and a half old. Nobody's exactly sure how the ship became wrecked, but considering it's in shallow water less than 12 feet beneath the surface, it's safe to say that it beached itself and got stranded. Today, the eerie remains of the ship are located right in front of people's beachfront property. It's become a popular place for divers and fishermen. I wonder how those homeowners feel about that. The ship still has its cabin and cargo hold preserved, accessible by creeping through the haunting interior of the ship. Just make sure you don't get lost while trying to find the captain's quarters, because you might never find your way back out.
Number 8. The Abandoned Sea Forts. The idea of staying in a cabin perched on stilts in the sea, as you might see in romantic Instagram photos of tropical vacations celebrities and influencers post, may sound amazing. But what if you get rid of the tropical waters and shallow seas? The abandoned sea forts have all of the structure and none of the glam you might imagine, and can be found off the coast of the United Kingdom. In Monsell, UK, amidst the chilling waters of the sea, stands tall a historical sea fort that dates back to the late 1800s. These forts were put to use when World War II was in progress in 1942 and served a very important purpose: to warn or prevent air raids and to relay info if enemy naval ships made their way into the United Kingdom. There were a total of 4 naval forts and 3 manned by the Army. The watchtowers and stations were first built on land and then moved into the sea, roughly 8 miles, 12.8 kilometers off the coast. The fort's locations worked to the advantage of the UK, and the soldiers stationed there managed to shoot down 22 planes and prevent 30 bombings. Ultimately, however, the sea forts were abandoned in 1950 at the end of the fighting. It later became a hiding spot for pirates, and today it is barren and abandoned. If you are interested in visiting, it is now a gloomy historical site that can only be accessed via boat. The forts are now barely standing afoot on their rusted supports. Of course, through the wear and tear over the years, the forts have gained an eerie appearance, and the interiors have deteriorated even more. The interior walls of the sea forts are covered in rust, and sheets of rusted metal are torn away everywhere, not to mention the dilapidated bridge that once connected each building. Indeed, the Monsell sea forts contain an interesting history, but much like an oil rig of today, the sea forts aren't a place for the faint-hearted. Number 7. Poveglia Island. Nestled between Venice and Lido is the small Italian island of Poveglia. For centuries, the island has been a place of exile and a dumping ground for the diseased, dying, and dead. In the year 421, Poveglia welcomed its first inhabitants, those who escaped barbaric invaders that basically destroyed the mainland. The island was too small for large armies to really care, so it was mostly left alone. For hundreds of years, this small community lived in peace. The people avoided the laws and taxes of the mainland. But people started to leave the island, and by the 14th century, it was completely abandoned. The bubonic plague arrived in Europe in 1348, and like many other small islands, Poveglia became a quarantine colony. 1 out of 3 Europeans died from the plague. Fearing the spread of the disease, Venice exiled anyone that had symptoms, sending them to die on the island. People were too sick to protest, and many were simply burned alive. But then the fire spread as quickly as the disease. Long after the fires were put out, Napoleon's military campaign relied on the island's haunted legends and defendable position to protect and store weapons. To make Poveglia even more creepy, in the 1800s an asylum was built. The institution was poorly constructed and was used as a place of exile instead of rehabilitation. In the 1930s, rumors spread that a doctor performed bizarre experiments on the patients, and eventually, he went mad and jumped from the bell tower to his death. And even though the bell in the tower was removed, locals claim to hear its chimes echo from the lonely island. Today, the entire island is abandoned, and it's actually illegal to visit. But even if you could, would you want to? Number 6. The Chu Mansion. In Shanghai, China, the Chu Mansion is considered as one of the most haunted and abandoned locations in China. It all began with its original owners, the Chu brothers. The Chu brothers were twins that sought their fortunes in Shanghai after World War I, and at the time, dye was quite expensive. The brothers were in possession of massive amounts thanks to their German former employer fleeing the city due to the conflict, leaving the brothers with the goods that would turn them into millionaires. They were also quite extravagant with their money, buying 2 mansions that were beside one another where the brothers lived with their friends and families. They had elegant gardens that they filled with exotic animals including tigers, crocodiles, birds, and more. However, the Chu brothers suddenly vanished without a trace, and from that point on, the connected mansions became desolate and the poor animals starved to death. Currently, only one of the mansions remains, while the other was demolished and lost to time. The remaining mansion is haunted enough to send some major shivers down your spine. There are bone-chilling stories about it that date back to 2009, from phantom animal bites that sent the nearby workers to the hospital, to allegedly lizard-like creatures possessing people to kill others. It would seem like the souls of the past animals came back to ravish those that touched their owner's property. Despite construction needs, most people are forbidden to go inside due to the lurking dangers, and there are multiple rumors, but reports are unsure about the truth behind the stories. Number 5. The Japanese Navy Underground Headquarters. Japan has its fair share of creepy places, but this one dates back to World War II, the former underground headquarters for the Japanese Navy. In Okinawa, Japan, there are numerous sites that now serve as historical symbols depicting the events of World War II. One of which is this eerie and creepy Japanese Navy underground headquarters, which was built in 1940 during the Battle of Okinawa. It can be accessed through a tunnel system in the city of Naha Tomaigusuku. Inside it is the forbidden history about the soldiers that fought to their last breath. However, not all of their deaths came from their enemies. Instead, some of it came from among themselves. Upon hearing the news of losing the battle, some of the soldiers committed suicide inside the underground premises. The most notable one was the hand grenade suicide. There are telegrams from previous battles that are still found lying around. The most disturbing one might be the last document issued before the commanding officer committed suicide seconds after writing it. It is estimated that 222 soldiers died inside the headquarters, while only 14 survived. Today, the underground headquarters are free to explore, but doing so feels creepy and uncomfortable, especially if you know the dark history of the tunnels. The rooms inside serve as a painful reminder of the war, and the tunnels are dark, poorly lit, and narrow. Visiting this location to explore would definitely be an adventure for those who seek pleasure in fear. Number 4. The Clark Air Base Hospital. In Pampanga, Philippines, an abandoned hospital that was built in 1960 and once had the most up-to-date treatment methods has now gained a certain reputation when it comes to the creepy factor and disturbing stories surrounding it. The Clark Air Base Hospital was once the Philippines' finest hospital until it was hit and damaged by a Japanese air raid, as it served as a stronghold for the US and Philippine armies. During that time, families were celebrating Christmas with the patients and soldiers. The bombing damaged the hospital beyond repair and killed the helpless civilians as well as soldiers inside. From that point on, Clark Hospital had become a barren and abandoned location, and according to the locals, haunted by the souls of the victims killed in the bombing. Considered by National Geographic to be one of the creepiest abandoned places on Earth, Clark Air Base's abandoned hospital is now a dark exploration spot for tourists. Today, if you look inside the hospital, you'll find scattered debris and other evidence of the painful past. Locals say if you listen closely enough and look hard enough, you can hear and spot the rumored ghosts of the hospital. Spooky, right? Number 3. The Island of the Dolls. In Xochimilco, Mexico, an island nicknamed the Island of the Dolls is terrifying to gaze upon. Immediately visible are the strange dolls that adorn the branches of the trees, rather than fruits or flowers as you might expect. So, what's the story behind this creepy island? It starts in the mid-20th century. Don Julian, a man with his wife, decided to live a solitary life on an island. During that time, he was dismayed when he spotted a dead body of a young girl, who was later revealed to be a girl that drowned while swimming with her friends, washed up on the island's canal with a doll. Don Julian somehow thought nothing of this and buried the girl, but soon misfortune overtook him, and Don Julian started seeing the girl everywhere. So he and his wife built an altar for the girl, and if that wasn't enough, Don Julian took the doll that came with the girl and hung it up on a tree. Somehow he wasn't satisfied with doing just that, so he proceeded to hang 1,000 more throughout the 50 years of his life, and eventually he died, suffering a heart attack in the same canal where the girl was found. This news spread like wildfire, and the island became a hotspot for tourists who came in to witness the decaying, dismembered dolls hanging around the entire island. Some even believe that Don Julian didn't die of a simple heart attack, but instead was dragged by the ghost of the girl who drowned him in the canal. Would you risk a visit to this terrifyingly decorated island? Let us know in the comments below, and make sure you like and subscribe as well. Number 2. The Suicide Forest. In Nagasaki, Japan, resides a place commonly known as the Suicide Forest. This location in nature has become a destination well known for its yearly casualties of about 100 people. Now, there's not much to explain, since even experts are baffled by the reason why so many people choose to commit suicide in this forest. It may be a coincidence, or it may be a greater power pulling people into their deaths. Even the stories from the tourists who visit the forest are no joke. From vengeful spirits, distorted whispers, and unknown blood-curdling screams, to real dead bodies hanging around the forest, people have apparently seen and heard it all. Truly, the Suicide Forest is not a place you want to be, even if you're just planning to explore. With its weird ambiance and oddly warped trees, the forest itself is haunting in its own right. You may, however, pay tribute to those who lost their lives inside the forest. But by no means should you go there with that one specific purpose. And if you do, there are numerous things that'll help you stop from taking the next step. Like a sign reminding you of your loved ones, to an old man down the road blasting lovely music to distract you from reality. But nothing can take away the name that the forest has earned for itself. It certainly is a bone-chilling place to witness and visit. Number 1. The abandoned Soviet Union bunker. In 2017, just below an abandoned factory in Russia, a bunker that belonged to the Soviet Union was found. Inside it was the remnants of what used to be a place for soldiers to defend against the enemies in World War II. The bunker appears to be decrepit and had remained untouched for decades, with all the equipment and items left in place, collecting dust. However, between the rooms that once held the Soviet Union soldiers was a littered area with gas masks, paperwork, and clothes spread all around, signifying that whoever left the place left in a hurry. The entire bunker itself gave off a creepy ambiance with an airtight atmosphere. Thankfully, the person that discovered the bunker, YouTuber Shai, made it out and shared his findings with the world. We got to uncover another undiscovered location, but due to this, we have little to no information about what happened in the bunker, about whether or not someone had died in there, or why it was abandoned. Whatever that may be, the answer may reveal itself in time. These are all creepy, but some of these abandoned places were truly terrifying. Which abandoned place are you most fascinated by? Let us know in the comments, and thanks for watching today. Make sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell for notifications. See you next time. Bye!